Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another VES-Artex Academy webinar. Today, we're speaking with Dr. Whitney Knauer from the University of Minnesota, and we're talking about paired housing for dairy calves and the current best practices and tips for success. So just before we get started, I'd like to point out that you're able to ask questions through the question and answer section at the bottom of your screen. You can also put them into the chat as well, and we'll discuss those at the end of the presentation. So for now, I'd just like to say welcome, Dr. Knauer, and we're excited to have you speak for us.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for that introduction and thanks for the opportunity to speak with you all today. So I'm an assistant professor here at the University of Minnesota, and I spend a lot of my time teaching veterinary students, but also spend about 25% of my time doing research. And one of my areas is paired housing of dairy calves, and really trying to find the best thing for the calf and for the producer. So we'll talk a little bit today about best practices as far as we know so far. So we'll get started. So I like to start my social housing presentations with this question. And so this was a question that has been posed twice to an audience of individuals. And so the first one was in 2018, and that was at the Dairy Cattle Welfare Council annual meeting. And it was after Dr. Nina von Kaiserlink gave a presentation on some of the big welfare challenges associated with calf management. And so the audience was polled saying, what do you think where's the future of calf housing? And you can see that the vast majority of participants thought that we would be housing our calves socially in some way. And this is basically a reversal of what is currently out there. So right now, about 75% of calves in North America are housed individually, with the other 25% being in pairs all the way up to large groups. And so that was 3 years ago now. And then I posed the same question to a group of veterinarians at our AABP annual meeting back in October. And you can see that although there's a little bit more bias to individual housing for veterinarians, you can see that the vast majority are still thinking that we're going to be housing our calves socially in some capacity. And I think the bias towards small groups is probably more from a labor saving standpoint, but regardless, I think when we need to start thinking about how we can implement these types of systems successfully with the best outcomes for both the producer and the calf. So moving right along. So, my bias is to pair over group housing because I think it's an easier transition. So I think the transition from an individual housing system to a pair is a lot easier for a variety of reasons than going from individual to group. And so for those of you who are producers, I think when we think about it, there's really not a change in milk delivery system. We have fewer changes to the general calf management. We don't typically need to do any building, and we can usually adjust and adapt both pens that we might be using in a barn and hutches to this housing strategy. And I would say that even these sort of dome style hutches that we see in the bottom, there are still ways that we can potentially pair house in that sort of hutch system. And I think in general, it's a more acceptable change for producers. And in addition, we have the advantages of social housing, which we'll talk about in the next slide and throughout this presentation, without the detrimental health effects of large groups. So we know with large groups, there are definitely health challenges and potentially weaning challenges when we think about weaning groups of animals at a time. And so again, what are the benefits? And so when we think about a small group or a pair versus individual, we have increased grain intake, increased line time, and decreased vocalizations, and that all kind of surrounds the time of weaning. And so we have an advantage at weaning. And then another thing, thinking more on the behavior side, we have reduced fear in a novel environment. So when you put a calf into a new pen, she's less fearful, and we have an increased ability to learn a task. And so these things, again, become really, really important when we're thinking about weaning. Right? So we're asking a calf to go into a new environment. We're probably changing her nutrition. And if we can sort of mitigate the social stress, we can potentially improve that calf and improve that calf's transition through the weaning phase. And so sort of the way that I structure this presentation is we're going to kind of go through, we know the what, right? The what is pair housing, but we're going to go through the why, the who, the when, and the how. And then have lots of time, hopefully at the end, to answer any questions that you all may have, and that hopefully I've answered, but maybe not to your satisfaction. So we've already talked a little bit about the why, but I'm going to show you a little bit more data. So what does the research tell us about why we should be pair housing our calves? So first and foremost, a variety of studies now, and the one on the bottom there in that graphic is real data from a commercial dairy. We have improved growth. So, and this is anywhere from 0.3 to 0.4 pounds per day in improved growth during the pre-weaning period. And that is, I have peak milk offered here because it's regardless of how much milk you're feeding, which I think is a really important concept. So even if you would expect a calf that's drinking 9 liters a day to be growing really, really well, but we still see an advantage when we pair versus individually house those calves. The other thing, and these are all statistically significant differences, whatever, but they're definitely biologically important ones. So when we think about final body weight at weaning, which I'll show you in a second, we have a real advantage there. And then this one on the bottom is, again, from a commercial dairy. So they're pair housing, and they're feeding 3 liters 3 times a day. And they saw an advantage in the pair versus individual. The rest of these studies are all research studies that are on research herds or in university herds, but there is some real world data out there emerging that these calves do grow better. And the big reason we think that is starter intake, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. And then the other thing to keep in mind that hasn't been teased out in the literature so much is that when we think about going beyond the pre-weaning period, what is the effect there? And so we did a study here at the University of Minnesota on our campus dairy, where we have calves born in the wintertime, and we did individual versus pair, and then we followed them all the way to 4 months of age and did a bunch of measurements. But one of the things that we measured was body weight. And so when we look at the weaning weights between these two, and I apologize, this is for those of you who are Canadian, this is in pounds, or European or anywhere really other than the US, this is in pounds, I apologize. But we have, an 18-pound advantage in the pair calves at weaning. And then that actually persisted to 16 weeks of age, but we had a lot more variation around that. There's, the calves were being fed at a feed bunk, and so there was more competition, and so that difference, the significance of that difference went away, but it's still a potential biologically important difference. So these calves have an advantage beyond that pre-weaning period. And again, the reason we think this is because of starter intake, which we'll talk about now. So majority of studies show that we have improved starter intake both during the pre-weaning period and then during the weaning phase. And so this is a study where these calves were actually being offered ad lib acidified milk. So those calves could drink as much milk as they wanted throughout the day. And then they were weaned at 50 days, and there were only 10 calves per group. So 10 individually housed calves, and then 10 calves housed in pairs. And you can see that, after about 3 weeks of age, those pair calves were eating significantly more starter as compared to those individual calves. And then when we look again, so that's, during the pre-weaning period, and then when we look during the weaning phase and then post-weaning, those differences continue. So this is a different study where they were feeding a little less milk, weaned a little later, same amount of calves per group. And we can see that at 7, 8, and 9 weeks of age, those calves that were pair housed were eating more starter grain. And we don't really know 100% why this is. Probably either competition, social facilitation. We know that cows, calves, cattle in general want to do things kind of at the same time as everyone else. And so the kind of working hypothesis is that these calves are kind of up, moving around. One of the pairs sees the calf eating some starter, the other calf goes over and investigates and then eats as well. So that's kind of the hypothesis as to why this happens. So improved body weight during the pre-weaning period and beyond, we have improved starter intake. And then here's a fairly important, probably, behavioral difference. So we did, again, that pair versus individual housing study. We put little activity monitors. So this little calf here, 3127, she's got this little blue activity monitor on her ankle. And she had that throughout the whole 4 months of the study. And we were particularly interested in looking at weaning and at entry to the weaned calf pen, what happens to the what happens to the individual calves versus the pair calves. And so those calves were moved from their hutches or their pairs down to a weaned calf pen, which is, you know, maybe a quarter mile down the road. This is a parking lot on campus, and they were placed either with their individual calves that were housed individually or calves that were housed in a pair. And then we said, okay, what are they doing? How much are they lying down? And this is what we found. So the 0 here is the kind of the minute, the second that they arrived in the wean calf pen. And then we looked back 7 days, and then we looked forward 7 days. And we found that on the day that calves entered that pen, there was a 14% difference in lying time. So the paired calves laid down almost more than 3 hours on that day more than the calves that were individually housed. And we just actually finished an analysis looking at kind of the differences in those behaviors between those calves, but I'll share with you this video, which kind of highlights a little bit what is going on in this pen. And so you probably don't need to be told, but the calves on the left-hand side of the screen are the previously paired calves, and then the 3 calves on the right side of the screen are the calves that were previously individually housed. And this is about 24 hours after the calves arrived in the pen. So you can see the calves on the left, that white calf there is chewing. So she's laying there chewing her cud. And then these other 3 calves are walking, running around, interacting with their environment, kind of learning how to be a social animal. And so, you know, the calves on the left-hand side, those previously paired calves, already kind of know how to do that. And so we have a pretty large study currently ongoing where we're going to be able to look and see if there's a health effect associated with this. Because you can imagine that the stress level in those calves on the right-hand side of the screen are higher. And we know that stress is associated with immune suppression. So again, just very, very interesting the way that these calves interact with their environment and with other calves. All right, and then this is sort of the last question that producers and veterinarians have about pair housing. What is the health like in these systems? And so there have not been large enough studies to say that pair housing is better than individual housing or vice versa. What we do know so far is that in all of the studies that have been published, that pair calves have had equivocal health to calves housed individually. And there have been a few studies even very recently that have shown like very transient differences in fecal scores, but those differences are fairly unimportant and they actually go both ways. So in one study, the pair calves had a little bit higher scours or higher fecal scores, and in the other study, the individual calves did. So it's sort of a wash right now as to whether or not the pair calves are healthier or not. And so again, we have a big study that is going to be able to answer this question, but we don't have all the data collected yet. So stay tuned for that. What I will share with you is we did a study where we asked the question, when should we pair? And we'll talk about this in a little bit later in the presentation. But should we form the pair at birth, which is probably the easiest from a management standpoint, or should we form the pair later in life? And the idea with 30 days, which was in this study, halfway through the pre-weaning period, was that at 30 days, calves are going to get over their scours. They're going to potentially have had their first respiratory disease event. So they should be pretty healthy and raring to go at 30 days. So there shouldn't be a detriment there. And what we found in this study is that there was no difference. So, we had pretty high treatment rates, and this is first treatment event. So, equivocal amount of treatment in calves that were paired at birth versus paired at 30 days during the pre-weaning period for that first treatment event. Important to note that only one calf in a late pair was treated after pairing. So we can maybe say that, we don't really have enough numbers to say this, but we can maybe say that the pairing didn't, increase the risk of treatment. But again, we need lots and lots of calves and lots of replication to make a declaration about health in these systems. A couple more things, sort of observations that I will say is that in this study in particular, I had an excellent student who was very observant, who was actually feeding the calves as well as collecting all the data. And she observed that when there was a healthy calf and a sick calf in a pair, that the healthy calf actually tended to do better, probably due to less competition with that pair mate, but she did make that observation. And then we're doing a study right now looking at triplets. And one of the observations from the calf health team was that when you have 3 calves, and I think this is true in pairs too in Hutches, but I need to make some more observations to say for sure that the sick calf will often isolate. And so we know that behavior is one of the big things that we look at when we're trying to identify sick animals. Feeding time, or just, based on our own knowledge of what a healthy calf should look like versus a sick one. But this might be an opportunity where you would, at feeding time, or if you see calves that are isolated in different hutches, that might be an animal, or those animals that you would go and investigate. All right, so that's sort of a whirlwind as to the why. So just in summary, right, we've got improved pre-weaning, average daily gain, and weight gain during the pre-weaning period. We have improved starter intake. We have improved behaviors associated with calmness, I guess, improved line time at weaning. And then we have no evidence so far to suggest that the health is worse in pair versus individual calves. So that's kind of the summary of the why. So now we'll go into the who. And this is mostly what producers rather than what calves. But I just want to make this point that social housing, really social housing of any kind, will sort of highlight weaknesses in a calf management system. So when we're thinking about whether or not we want to make this change, we need to look at benchmarking how we're doing currently. And so producers who are interested in this should already be doing a good job with their calves. Just like with large group housing, it's not a substitute for good calf people and good observations. So I just have here sort of the industry averages and suggested goals for some of these important calf health, pre-weaning calf health metrics. And so we have, failure passive transfer rate of less than 10%. We want a pretty low pre-weaning mortality, 3%. We want to have low or, at least industry average scours and pneumonia rates, and then have pretty good pre-weaning average daily gain. So again, this is, especially if calves are hungry, if calves aren't doing well, in general, in individual housing, putting them in pairs is not going to fix that problem. So we need to pay attention. We need to benchmark before we make this decision to transition to pair housing or really social housing of any kind. So that's the who. Now we're going to move on to the when. So this is one of the big questions. When do we socially house these calves? At what point during the pre-weaning period? And so the majority of studies, which are 2, show that the biggest advantages that we see are in those first 3 weeks of the pre-weaning period. and that is mostly based on starter intake. So kind of the first study to ask this question was a study done at University of British Columbia in their animal welfare program. And they asked the question, what is the difference in starter intake and growth when we do an early pair? So those calves were paired in the first six days. Yes, day 6. A late pair, so 42 days, and that was 2 weeks prior to weaning. And then comparing that with individual calves. And so this question of if we pair them late, do they still do as well? Do we have the same advantage as if we paired them really early during the pre-weaning period? And I just have this is some more weight data for you, but this is average daily gains in those animals. And you can see that the early pair, and this is average daily gain over that 10-week period, had the advantage as compared to the late pair and the individual calves. And so these calves were fully weaned here. But you can see, so again, the early pair, that's the solid black line here, where they're far and away above the other two groups, the late pair and the individual calves. You can imagine that the late pair were probably trying to figure out the social things. And so they were doing that instead of eating grain, which is probably why we don't see that advantage. And then another study that was just recently published looked at the same question, but they compared to 3 weeks of age. So pairing at birth or pairing at 3 weeks of age compared to individually housed calves. And they actually found that when we look at starter intake during that pre-weaning period, the calves that were paired at birth and the calves that were paired at 3 weeks had pretty equivocal starter intake. So, if we need to delay, if we need to wait a couple weeks, it's not going to hurt those calves, and we're probably going to see the same benefits when it comes to starter intake and growth. And then I'll just say that in the same study where we paired at birth versus 30 days of age, we did not see we measured starter intake, and we did not see an advantage to starter intake in that study. So that tells me that 30 days is probably too late. So again, we're looking at kind of those first 3 weeks of age. And just speculating here, but this might have something, calves don't really eat a lot of starter grain in the first 3 weeks. So it might be that, if we pair them later, they don't learn to eat together, versus if we pair them earlier, when they start actually eating starter, that, they start eating more and more, and we have that competition or that social facilitation. So again, first 3 weeks is best. Other considerations, so I know this is a question that a lot of people have. What else should we think about when we're forming this pair? And so, beyond the, 1 week birth, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, calves should be vigorous and they should be drinking well. So this is the same criteria kind of that I would use to put a calf on an auto feeder. They should be kind of able to hold their own and do well. They should be doing well before you give them that social change. In general, my recommendation is usually to have no more than 14 days between pair mates, 7 ideally. And this is a bigger challenge on smaller operations that want to implement pair housing. Sometimes, depending on how many heifers we have per year, or calves in general that we have per year, we have a little bit more of a stretch between ages in a pair. Ideally, again, 7 days with maybe stretching out to 14 days, but probably not more than that. And then, another option would be to start calves individually. And there's a farm that is doing that down in southern Minnesota, where they start calves individually for, the first about week of age, and then they form the pair. Another thing is calf size. And so I'll share with you. So we have had a couple studies done up here at the campus dairy, and we've had some sort of monsters paired with little calves. We had or have crossbred, so pro-cross up on the dairy, and they tend to be a little smaller at birth. And so this is an example, this 41 and 40. So 41 was 81 pounds at birth. 40 was 55. You can see she's the little one here, and she tripled her body weight by weaning. So she did well. Same thing here. So we've got these two, kind of got the monster on the right, 88 pounds versus 67 pounds. And when I looked at their data, they had identical average daily gains. So that is, you know, I probably would not put a Holstein bull calf with a Jersey because of that. That's a very big size difference. You know, if I had Jerseys and Holsteins on my operation, I would probably do Jerseys with Jerseys and Holsteins with Holsteins. But it might be okay. Some people do question or ask about bullying. And so that's something to keep in mind, and, you know, making sure that you have people who are watching the calves. But we at least have two examples where that was not potentially a problem, but then was not actually a real problem. All right. So the last thing we'll kind of talk about is the how. All right, so couple options when we're thinking about modifying hutches to pair house. So most of this decision will be based on what materials you have available and then how you're delivering milk to those calves. So this, the picture on the top here, these are a pair on our campus dairy, and these calves are soon to be nipple fed, which I'm very excited about. But currently, or when this study was happening, we're getting fed in buckets in their hutch. And so in that case, we need to provide at least some space between the hutch so a human can get in there. And then what we did is we just took the kind of square front part that goes in front of the hutch when it's individual, and then just kind of like stretched it out and used some carabiners and snapped it together and created our pair. Another option, so down here, so this is a photo from Quebec, and a research study by Dr. Vassar up there. And they were feeding these calves with ad lib acidified milk. Probably acidified. It was at least ad libitum. So these calves are getting ad lib milk, you know, from this nipple here. And these calves, you can see it's kind of like a circular area outside of the hutch to form. This is an individual calf, I'm pretty sure, but the pair calves are over here. So same idea. This is from a study that was done at Wisconsin, which we'll talk about in a few slides, to talk about cross-sucking, which is the thing that lots of people have questions about when it comes to social housing, really of any kind. But in this study that we're feeding from, these are actually starter bottles, so the Braden starter bottles, but these calves are being fed either in a milk bucket or with like peach teats, the milk bars. Same idea here though, we sort of have a square outer area and then have two hutches that are put together. And then this is another option, not my favorite, but this is another option that producers could use to pair their calves. And so this is where we sort of have front facing hutches, and then we just put a fence between the two. And I don't like this for a couple reasons. One is that it creates labor inefficiencies because you can't do drive-by feeding or walk-by feeding. So that's a challenge. Another thing is it's not as easy to observe the calves. So if you're walking in front, you can, look in each hutch and you can see the calves here. You kind of have to, walk around. So again, hard to observe calves, probably hard to feed them. So not the best, but an option to do that front-facing pairing. So that's using hutches. What about pair housing in barns? So lots of different options here. And the majority of the time, what we're talking about is calves that were previously probably housed individually. For example, this picture here on the bottom, where we just have these plastic dividers for, between calves. And a lot of producers are already removing those at some point during the pre-weaning period, particularly around weaning. So those calves kind of get used to being that social interaction and start to understand what it means to be a social creature. But those can really easily be modified. So, pull out that middle divider and you form your pair. That's kind of this picture at the top with the wood. I'm not a big fan of wood from a disease control standpoint, but this was a really old 3-sided curtain barn in Minnesota, and they've been pair housing for 9 years, I think. They went to a meeting, heard about it, and were like, yeah, we can do that, and started doing it and do a really nice job. But they just, again, remove sort of a center divider. This is that same operation. They have some calf-tail panel pens in a barn. And so that's another place you just remove the center divider. And then here's a picture, again, from UBC, from the animal welfare program up there, that their dairy, where again, we have the potential to have individually housed calves, but we've removed, again, that center divider. The other thing, and this is maybe more important for larger farms, but really any farm, I mean, hutches take up a lot of space. So when we think about on a space per cement pad or dirt pad or whatever you're using for your calves basis, when we pair house, we actually can improve space utilization. So this is just a little addition to why pairing in hutches might be good from a space efficiency standpoint. So when we have these hutches, and we have 4 rows of hutches, let's say, and I think there's 11 hutches here. So, and we've got equal space in between each of these hutches. We can put 44 hutches on that space. If we pair halves, we can actually, we put those hutches together if we can do that, if we're feeding from the front, and which would be likely, this would probably be a drive-by sort of feeding plan. If we put the same amount of space between hutches, we can actually put 30% more hutches on a given space. So again, we can put 44 calves in this square, and we can add calves if we're pair housing them in hutches on a cement pad or some outdoor space. So again, probably efficient or more efficient from a space utilization standpoint. All right, some other things. So I've had questions, but this is a while ago now, the questions from producers saying, hey, can we just put 2 calves in 1 hutch? And my answer to that is no. Even the extra large hutches still aren't quite big enough for 2 calves. And when we think about this from a ammonia, from a manure, from a liquid standpoint, having adequate resting space for 2 calves is really important. So I recommend 35 square feet of space per calf. And I mean, 35 square feet or a hutch, some of those hutches are only 32 square feet, whatever, a hutch per calf, or a pen per calf. We don't want to put 2 calves in the space for 1 calf. And one of the reasons for this, again, from kind of a liquid management standpoint, if we think about, one of my colleagues here at the University of Minnesota likes to talk about straw being like a diaper. If we think about it from that standpoint, these calves spend a lot of time together. So, some of our work, some of the published work that's out there, they'll spend anywhere between 60 and 80% of time when they're observed in the same hutch, especially when they're laying down. So, we still don't know, is there hutch preference? I don't know yet about that, but for sure, we want to make sure that they have enough space that they can each lay down in a hutch and then together. All right, so moving on to milk feeding practices, and here's where we'll touch base a little bit about cross-sucking, which is, again, big challenge in these systems. So one way that we can get around that is to feed a lot of milk. So I recommend really for all calf systems, at least 6 liters of milk per day of a high quality milk, right? Or a high quality milk replacer. And ideally fed from a nipple bucket or a nipple bottle. And the reason for this, again, is cross-sucking. So this is a really, really cool study that was just published this year, where a group at Wisconsin asked the question, can we reduce cross-sucking? Really important question. Can we reduce cross-sucking in calves that are pair housed? And they looked at this sort of 2 different ways. So they said, can we integrate a nipple bucket with a slow flow teat alone, or in combination with a starter bottle. So this is a braid-in starter bottle. And the really important thing here is that we don't want to give all the starter here. We want to actually provide starter in a bucket too. But this provides the calf, an opportunity to, orally manipulate something else. And that something else is a nipple. They get some grain out of there. And so they looked at this compared to feeding milk in a bucket. And so they found a couple things. The first important thing here is that the slow flow teat increased milk feeding time. So by 6 minutes. So these calves, all of you probably have seen calves drink from a bucket, they suck that milk down. They, do that in like 2 minutes, and that's a gallon of milk. So that's a lot of milk. It's 2 liters a minute. That's pretty fast. It's really fast actually. Versus 8 minutes. So when the slow flow teat, they drank that same amount of milk in a longer period of time. And then when we look and see, when we're observing how much cross-sucking was observed during that time, we can see that the milk teat really reduced the amount of cross-sucking. They still saw a little bit of cross-sucking, but not nearly as much as they saw when calves were drinking from a bucket. And that was true both during the pre-weaning and the weaning phase. And then when we add the braid-in, the starter bottle on top of that, we can see that also reduced cross-sucking in animals that were fed with a milk bucket. So they were, satisfying their behavioral need to nurse through that starter bottle. So feeding high quantities of milk using a slow flow teat, very important. And the nursing and the amount of time it takes to nurse is really important, because we know that the majority of cross-sucking happens after milk feeding time. So this is some data. I don't know why I haven't thought of this before, but I just crunched these numbers today. And so this is some data that we collected where we, at feeding time, both morning and evening feedings, 1 time per week, we walked by the calves every 2 minutes and asked the question, what are they doing? And we had a whole list of things that they could be doing. And one of the things was cross-sucking. And so the 0 represents milk feeding, and the arrow, I guess, represents milk feeding time. And then, everything that is on kind of the positive side of that is after milk feeding. Everything on the negative side of that is before milk feeding time. You can see in this study, the majority of cross-sucking is happening in those first 10 minutes after milk feeding. So again, if we can occupy those calves, if we can feed them enough milk to satisfy their behavioral need, if we can provide that in a slow flow teat, we can provide them a nipple to nurse on after they feed, all these things will increase the amount of time that they're doing that and decrease the amount of time that they have to think about cross-sucking. So again, and another thing in this study is that we observed cross-sucking in at least once in 94% of pair observations. So it is a risk, it is a challenge. So what else can we do to try to prevent it? So we can add a barrier. So there have been a few studies now that show that adding a barrier between calves at milk feeding time can reduce the risk both of milk stealing, so that calves like, ooh, what are you doing? And they try to steal milk from their pair meat. And it also reduces the risk of cross-sucking, because calves are kind of in a stall, if you will, and are kind of held there by that 1 meter barrier. The other thing, so that an example of that kind of in the real world, so this is a farm where they were playing around with pair housing, and they were actually pair housing Holstein calves in a single hutch, which I would not recommend, but that's what they were trying to do. And you can see this is at milk feeding time, and they have in between these 2 calves, they have another piece of hog panel. And then what they do is for the first week or 2 during the milk feeding period, during the pre-weaning period, when these calves are in a pair, they put a PVC pipe behind them to kind of lock them in to their milk feeding stall, if you will. And they found that calves learn where their milk feeding stall is, and it reduces the risk of cross-sucking. Again, remember, we want to mitigate that behavior 10 minutes after feeding, because that's when the majority of it happens. And so there are producers here in Minnesota for sure that feed milk in buckets and want to feed milk in buckets. And so what's another way that we can do? We can, reduce the risk of cross-sucking. So here we did a study, a little tiny study that asked a different question, but this is what we were doing is we were separating calves at milk feeding time. And so I bought these little dog crates, and that, for the majority of the time, it was kind of accordioned up against this plastic panel in the middle of the two hutches. But at feeding time, the calf feeders would kind of walk through, they would separate the calves, they would come through and feed, they would come through and do their milk and their water and their starter grain, and then they would come through and put the calves back together. And so in general, those calves were separated anywhere between 30 and 45 minutes. And the actual procedure that the calf feeders added about a minute per pair per feeding, so not super labor efficient, but in this study, the feeders actually liked doing it because when they didn't do it, they were stressed out. They felt that they were worried that the calves weren't getting the milk that was theirs. And so this is another option. We did a bunch of behavioral observations in the study as well. And we have observed zero cross-sucking when utilizing this sort of separation at milk feeding time. I don't know if this is true, and maybe some of you have more experience watching calves day in and day out than I do, but I think that cross-sucking is a learned behavior, and if we can reduce the calves' ability to learn how to do it, then we can potentially mitigate that behavior during the weaning phase, during the post-weaning period, and beyond. All right, what else? So kind of wrapping up here, the last thing that we'll talk about is we want to provide a water and a starter bucket for each calf. And again, the big reason for this is that we have calves that want to do the same thing at the same time. So we want to give them the opportunity to eat grain from two different buckets at the same time. And again, there's many different ways that we can do that. So these are individually housed calves, but essentially housed together because they have nose-to-nose contact, like all down a row of calves. Not ideal, again, from a health standpoint, but they definitely can see each other doing things. Same here. So this is a dairy in Minnesota where they have a shade cloth, which is awesome, over their pairs of calves, and they have their water bottles on the outside, but because of rain, the green buckets are on the inside of the hutches. And then here's just an example in a barn where we have water and green buckets in that pen, one for each calf. All right, some of the other challenges of pair housing. So labor at feeding time. So for sure, there is a potential increase in labor, especially when we're thinking about training calves, if we're thinking about separating calves at feeding time. So that is a potential downside. Sick calf management. So what do we do when a calf and a pair get sick? This is an option. So this is just a picture of what this calf on the left was being treated for scours, and we essentially just separate those calves. So that from a social standpoint might not be the best thing to do, but for sure we'll be able to treat that calf. We'll be able to watch that calf a little more closely, make sure she's getting the milk that she is allocated, any treatments that she's getting. So that's one option there. Cross-sucking, so we talked a little bit about ways to mitigate cross-sucking, but that is a challenge in these systems. And then modifying hutches and fences, so could be expensive, could be a challenge. I think that there are definitely ways to modify things pretty simply, and certainly some of the hutch manufacturing companies are developing different fences, but certainly, hog panel can be used just as easily as something a little fancier. All right, so moving on to our summary. So here's our summary of best practices. So we'll just kind of run through these. So again, we want to be doing a good job with our calves already. We want to be hitting at least those benchmarks that were mentioned for calf health and growth. We want to ideally pair within the first 3 weeks of life. And remember, that's going to give us that starter intake benefit throughout the pre-weaning period, which will translate to improved growth. We want to double the space needed for one calf. So not throwing 2 calves into the space for one, but providing adequate resting space. So 2 hutches, 2 calves, 2 pens, 2 calves. We want to provide at least 6 liters per day in high quality milk or milk replacer. And ideally through a teat bucket or a bottle, so that promotes that natural suckling behavior and reduces the risk of cross sucking. If we do run into that, or if we want to feed with a bucket, putting a barrier between those calves at milk feeding time is really helpful to mitigate milk stealing, milk switching, and cross sucking. And then 1 water and starter bucket per calf. And so that's all I have. It was a lot of information, but I would like to, I've got a lot of students, a lot of veterinarians and people up at the campus area that have helped with this. So I would like to acknowledge them, and then would definitely be, oops, oh goodness. There we go. There's a beautiful picture of Minnesota in January. Excited to answer any questions that I didn't adequately address in the presentation.
Thank you very much. I think the questions that we have been answered through the presentation, but one of them, and forgive me if I missed this, but what's the maximum age difference in the calf pair?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I don't think we really know for sure to say that it's 14 days or it's 7 days or it's 21 days. I probably wouldn't go that high. When we think from a management and disease risk standpoint, I like to say 7 day, no more than a 7 day age difference between calves in a pair. I think we could probably increase that a little bit, maybe to 14 days. But you run into differences in disease status, you run into differences in body weight, you run into feeding differences potentially in those calves. So no more than 14 days, ideally 7 days.
Perfect. And so we have had a couple of questions with regards to the type of ventilation in different facilities. Yeah. And I know that ventilation is super important. And do you have any experience with the types of ventilation, or should we direct people to other sources?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and very complicated to think about ventilating calves. I think, when we're thinking about hutches, that's an easier answer. Hutches are outside. We're talking natural ventilation, opening up vents in the spring or summer or even winter time. But when we're talking about barns, that becomes a much more complicated answer because it depends on a lot of things. So I usually, whenever I have a question or don't know an answer about calf ventilation, I always rely on the group at Wisconsin. So the Dairyland Initiative has amazing resources for calf facility design, ventilation. They're the pioneers on positive pressure ventilation. So, the big thing is, and this is especially important as we're kind of moving into winter, is we want to ventilate calves without chilling them. So we want to ventilate them without drafting them. And again, it's very facility dependent. And so I would direct anyone who has further questions to that group.
Perfect. And we also have a webinar that's focused on calf barn design. So if you visit our YouTube channel, you can find that. I'd like to say thank you very much for speaking to us today. We really appreciate it. And for everybody who's watching, feel free to check back in with us or sign up for our newsletter. We'll have a whole new range of webinars for next year. So thank you very much, everyone. I hope you have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.